The loud, rhythmic screech of my heavy luxury luggage wheels echoed sharply against the towering glass ceilings of Denver International Airport. It was a crisp, beautifully bright Tuesday morning, the kind of vibrant day that makes a man feel profoundly alive and full of renewed purpose. At 70 years old, I was finally doing exactly what everyone, especially my team of expensive cardiologists, had been desperately telling me to do for the better part of a decade. I was officially stepping back. For 40 grueling, relentless years, I had poured every single ounce of my blood, sweat, and soul into building Caldwell commercial real estate, from a single rented metal desk into a massive, unstoppable corporate empire stretching across the entire American West. I missed countless holidays. I missed quiet family dinners. I sacrificed my own fleeting youth to ensure my family would never know the bitter, terrifying taste of poverty I had endured. And now, I was finally handing the reins of power over to my 38-year-old son, Preston. We stood together on the concrete curb outside the exclusive VIP departure terminal. Preston looked incredibly sharp, projecting absolute corporate authority in his tailored navy Italian suit. It was the exact same custom, aggressive fit I used to wear when I was an ambitious young man. He was the golden child, meticulously groomed from birth to sit at the absolute head of the executive boardroom table. He checked his solid gold watch, the exact timepiece I had proudly purchased for him when he closed his very first $1 million commercial acquisition. He smiled broadly, his eyes crinkling with what looked like genuine affection, and handed me a thick, glossy travel itinerary bound in a beautiful dark leather folder. 3 weeks completely off the grid, Dad, Preston said, his voice full of confident warmth. No cell service, no emergency board meetings, no frantic emails from the legal department. Just you, the deep jungle, and some absolute peace and quiet at the most exclusive eco-resort in Cambodia. You deserve this more than anyone else on earth. You built this massive empire from the ground up. Now, just let me run it for a while. I patted his broad shoulder, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of accomplishment welling up in my chest. I had successfully raised a highly capable, confident man, a son who cared deeply about my physical and mental well-being. I told him I trusted him completely, and we shared a tight, meaningful embrace right there on the busy curb. I watched his black luxury SUV smoothly merge back into the heavy airport traffic. I felt completely at ease, ready for the next peaceful chapter of my life. I turned around, gripped the thick leather handle of my suitcase, and walked toward the sliding glass doors to check in for my international flight. That was the exact moment my perfect, comfortable reality shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. "Excuse me, sir." "Please wait." A heavy hand clamped down hard on my forearm. The grip was unusually tight, almost desperate in its intensity. I spun around, startled, fully prepared to shout at whoever was aggressively grabbing me. It was an older man wearing the blue uniform of a TSA agent. His plastic name tag read Vince. He looked to be around my age, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. But it was his face that completely stopped me from speaking. He was deathly pale, looking exactly as if he had just seen a ghost. Heavy sweat beaded on his wrinkled forehead, and his eyes darted around nervously, as if we were being actively tracked by a hidden sniper. Before I could demand to know what was going on, he pulled me hard behind a thick concrete structural pillar, instantly obscuring us from the main drop-off lane and the expansive terminal windows. "What on earth are you doing?" I demanded, forcefully pulling my arm out of his grasp. "I need to catch an international flight. Do not get on that plane," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely push the words past his teeth. "Please, sir, just listen to me for 1 second." I looked at him, feeling completely confused and mildly annoyed. I asked him if he knew who I was, assuming this was some kind of elaborate corporate prank or a desperate extortion attempt. "I do not know your name," Vince said, swallowing hard and wiping his sweaty forehead. "But I know the man who just dropped you off. I was taking my morning smoke break behind the concrete barriers near the VIP lane. I saw your son drop you off. I saw you hug him, but the absolute second you turned your back and started walking toward those doors, his whole demeanor violently changed. It was like a switch flipped. I frowned, a cold, incredibly uncomfortable prickle starting at the base of my neck. "What do you mean?" Vince looked around the pillar before leaning closer. He got back into his luxury car, but he did not drive away immediately. He rolled his tinted window down and pulled out a cheap plastic phone, a burner phone. He dialed a number and started talking. He was furious, sir. He was giving highly aggressive, very specific orders. I told the agent he must have entirely misunderstood the situation. Preston was the chief executive officer of a major commercial firm. He was likely just handling a sudden, aggressive crisis with a difficult contractor. No, Vince insisted, grabbing my arm again, his grip even tighter this time. Listen to me very carefully. He looked right at you walking away, and he said exactly this. The old man is boarding. He is entirely out of the picture for 3 weeks. Transfer all the corporate debt to his personal accounts and trigger the bankruptcy filings immediately. Make absolutely sure he takes the fall for everything. The words hung in the chilly morning air like a brutal, inescapable death sentence. Transfer the debt, trigger the bankruptcy, make sure he takes the fall. My world completely stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the bustling airport, the automated announcements echoing over the loudspeakers, the low, powerful roar of commercial jet engines taking off in the distance, it all instantly faded into a dull, heavy hum. The entire universe tunneled down to the frightened face of the man standing in front of me. I stared at Vince, searching his eyes for any sign of deceit. I looked for any indication that he was hallucinating or trying to trick me. But there was absolutely nothing there except genuine, raw fear. Why would a random TSA agent risk his secure government job to pull a wealthy passenger aside and tell such a specific, horrific lie? He wouldn't. My breathing grew terribly shallow. My chest tightened so painfully, I genuinely thought I was having a massive heart attack. Preston, my own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway of our very first home. The man I had entrusted with my entire life's work. Was he actively bankrupting me? Was he planning to leave me with absolutely nothing while I was trapped in another country? I asked Vince to repeat exactly what he heard, demanding every single word without leaving anything out. Vince nodded, speaking quickly while constantly looking over his shoulder. He said, transfer the debt to his personal accounts. Trigger the bankruptcy filings immediately, and then he said, make sure he takes the fall. Sir, I do not know what kind of aggressive business you are in, but that man is setting you up to take a massive, devastating hit. If you get on a plane for 20 hours, if you go off the grid for 3 weeks like he said on the phone, you are going to come back to absolute zero. Or much worse, you will be arrested by federal agents the moment you land back on American soil. My mind raced 1,000,000 miles a minute. 40 years of ruthless corporate negotiations violently kicked in. I was fighting desperately against the crushing emotional agony of a father hearing that his only son was plotting his absolute ruin. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced myself to think clearly, pushing the heartbreak down deep into my stomach and focusing entirely on survival. Thank you, I told Vince. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my silver money clip and pressed it firmly into his trembling hand. You never saw me today. You never heard anything. Go back to work right now and forget my face entirely. Vince nodded quickly, visibly relieved to be entirely done with the terrifying situation. He took the money, turned around, and slipped quietly away into the crowded airport terminal, leaving me entirely alone. I stood frozen behind the heavy pillar. The glossy travel itinerary felt like a concrete block in my hand. Cambodia, dense jungles, ancient temples, no cell service, no internet access. It was not a generous, loving vacation from a grateful son. It was an isolation chamber, a perfectly timed, beautifully disguised trap designed to keep me completely blind and deaf, while he actively dismantled my financial existence and framed me for his crimes. I leaned back against the cold concrete. My chest heaved up and down. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my heart. It was the specific kind of pain that comes from a betrayal so deep it physically breaks something inside of you forever. But then the blinding grief began to burn away, swiftly replaced by a familiar icy calculation. I had stared down ruthless corporate raiders. I had survived brutal market crashes that wiped out men half my age. I did not survive 40 years in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate by being a naive, helpless victim. If my own flesh and blood thought I was just some clueless old man he could toss into the garbage, he was about to learn a very painful, Very permanent lesson. I needed absolute proof before I tore my family apart. I needed to know if the man I raised was truly capable of leaving me with nothing. I pulled out my cell phone. My hands were shaking with a toxic mixture of dread and pure, unadulterated rage. I pushed myself off the cold concrete pillar, forcing my legs to move. I did not want to stand out. I gripped the handle of my leather suitcase and steered myself away from the ticketing counters, blending seamlessly into the morning rush of travelers. My vision tunneled. I veered toward the nearest men's restroom, bypassed the sinks, and locked myself inside the furthest stall. The space was cramped and smelled faintly of industrial bleach. I sat down heavily, staring at my phone screen. The wallpaper was a photo of Preston and me from a fishing trip in Montana 5 years ago. Now that smile felt like a thick, suffocating mask. I had to hear his voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my vocal cords. If Vince was right, showing my hand too early would be a fatal mistake. I tapped Preston's name and lifted the phone to my ear. On the fourth ring, the line clicked open. "Hey, Dad, did you forget something already?" Preston's voice washed over the line. It was smooth, cheerful, and completely untroubled. There was no tremor of guilt. He sounded exactly like the loving son who had just hugged me goodbye. No. I forced a light chuckle, aggressively rubbing the bridge of my nose. "I have my passport. I am just standing in line for security right now." "Good," Preston laughed warmly. "You had me worried for a second there. You tend to lose your reading glasses when you travel." The casual affection in his tone was highly disorienting. I had to push past the heavy emotional fog. I needed to cast the bait. "Actually, Preston," I started, keeping my pitch perfectly casual, "I am calling because something strange just happened." I had a very weird voicemail from one of the senior executives at First National. The banker sounded quite urgent. He mumbled something about a massive debt transfer and repeatedly mentioned the word bankruptcy. There was a pause on the line. It was a microscopic fraction of a second, but I noticed it instantly. The casual looseness had slightly tightened. "First National?" Preston repeated carefully. "What did they say?" It honestly sounded like he was trying to verify a sudden corporate filing. "I figured I should call you before I board this 20-hour flight, just to make sure there is no strange glitch in our accounts while my back is turned." I held my breath, bracing my body for his reaction. Preston let out a long, exaggerated sigh followed by a deeply fond, reassuring laugh. "Oh, Dad," he chuckled warmly. "You really cannot turn off that aggressive business brain, can you? There is zero fraud. Nobody is going bankrupt. I know exactly what First National was calling you about. Remember the Silverstone Plaza project? The old warehouse district development we paused last year?" I blinked. "Yes, I remember Silverstone perfectly well, but what exactly does that have to do with a sudden bankruptcy filing?" "I am moving the Silverstone debt into a newly formed subsidiary to liquidate that dead project," Preston explained smoothly. "It is a standard strategic move. By shifting that specific bad debt into a separate holding company and filing for a localized restructuring, we get a massive tax write-off for the quarter without affecting the main corporate umbrella." First National was probably just calling to confirm the automated transfer protocols. "You are supposed to be relaxing, Dad. Let me handle the heavy lifting." The lie was flawless, delivered with the warmth of a loving son. The line went dead. I sat alone in the silent bathroom stall. Preston had sounded so incredibly convincing, using the exact corporate jargon I had drilled into him for years. But my son had made one fatal, careless mistake. Silverstone Plaza was not a dead-weight project waiting for a strategic tax write-off. Silverstone Plaza had been fully and finally liquidated 4 months ago. I had personally negotiated the final sale of that specific acreage, and the funds had already cleared. There was absolutely no debt left to transfer. My son had just lied to my face with the practiced ease of a seasoned predator. The cold, heavy knot in my stomach tightened until it felt like a solid block of ice. I needed to know how far the damage had already spread. My hands were shaking so severely, I nearly dropped the phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my personal banking application. I completely bypassed the corporate accounts and navigated straight to my private retirement trust, my ultimate safety net built over 4 decades. I typed in my secure password. I waited for the loading screen to clear. The familiar blue interface did not appear. Instead, the screen went completely white. A stark red notification box popped up in the center of the display. Access denied legal hold. Please contact your branch administrator. Immediately, I stared at those words until they blurred together. A legal hold on a private trust of that magnitude was not a simple clerical error. It was a catastrophic, highly coordinated financial maneuver, requiring court orders, sworn affidavits, and a mountain of fabricated evidence presented to a federal judge. Preston had fundamentally dismantled my entire financial existence while I was busy packing my suitcase. Every warm smile, every reassuring pat on the back, was a calculated performance designed to set up the exact parameters needed to freeze my assets the moment I stepped out of the picture. Panic is a useless emotion in a crisis. You do not survive by freezing, you survive by moving forward. If Preston had the capability to legally freeze a heavily protected trust fund, he certainly had the resources to monitor my mobile device. Every location ping was a massive liability. I pulled the protective case off my phone with a sharp, forceful motion. I retrieved a small metal pen and aggressively popped open the side tray, dropping the tiny plastic SIM card into the palm of my hand. I pressed down hard until I felt the satisfying snap of the plastic breaking in half, dropped the broken pieces straight into the toilet, and flushed them away. I was completely disconnected. For the first time in 40 years, the founder of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate was entirely off the grid. I walked out into the bright, humming corridor of the airport. My luxury leather suitcase was sitting near the entrance. It contained 3 weeks' worth of expensive clothing and the naive illusions of a proud father heading into retirement. I walked straight past it, leaving it abandoned on the polished tile floor. Luggage meant a predictable pattern of travel. I could not afford that. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, stepped out into the crisp, biting air, and flagged down a passing cab, telling the driver to take me directly toward the dusty, forgotten industrial outskirts of Denver. I asked the driver to pull over at a dilapidated gas station. Inside, I bought a prepaid cellular phone and the maximum amount of cash load cards legally allowed in a single transaction. 3 blocks down the road, I paid for a cramped, gloomy room at a single-story motel with a flickering neon sign. Room number 7 smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner. The billionaire founder of a massive corporate empire was suddenly reduced to sitting on a squeaky metal folding chair in a $40 a night motel room. I placed the cheap plastic phone on the scratched wooden desk. I needed someone who completely understood the deep, complex financial plumbing of my entire company. More importantly, I needed someone who possessed absolute, unquestionable loyalty to me. Diane was my fierce, brilliantly analytical chief financial officer for more than 2 decades. We had bravely navigated the treacherous waters of the 2008 market crash together. Exactly 1 year ago, shortly after Preston was promoted, she abruptly announced her early retirement. Preston had claimed she was experiencing severe corporate burnout and offered her a lucrative severance package. Now, sitting alone in the gloomy light, the horrific truth finally clicked into place. Diane did not retire. Preston had systematically removed the only person in the entire corporate hierarchy who possessed the intelligence to catch his massive financial fraud. I keyed her number into the burner phone, praying her personal cellular number had not changed. The phone rang 4 agonizing times before the line abruptly clicked open. "Hello," Diane's voice was cautious. "Diane," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "It is Harrison Caldwell. I need you to promise me you will not hang up this phone." I heard a sharp, genuine intake of breath. "Harrison? Why do you sound like you are hiding in a closet? Are you not supposed to be flying over the Pacific Ocean right now?" "I did not get on that airplane," I told her firmly. "The trip was a trap. Preston has locked down my personal retirement trust, and I have reason to believe he is tearing the company apart from the inside. I am sitting in a cash-only motel room. I need your help immediately. Give me an address." "Harrison," she said without hesitation. "I will be there in 30 minutes. We met at a dilapidated diner, 2 miles from my motel." Diane slid into the torn vinyl booth across from me, placing a heavy canvas messenger bag on the table. She looked at my pale face and the sheer desperation I was trying to mask. "I always knew this terrible day would come," she whispered softly. "I just prayed I was wrong about him. You knew Preston was planning something malicious? I asked, feeling a sharp pang of betrayal. Not the specific details. Diane shook her head. But I knew the company was being systematically hollowed out. A year ago, Preston brought in an outside technology firm. He claimed it was a routine security upgrade. But the people leading the project were brought in entirely by Monica. Monica, my daughter-in-law, was a prominent socialite. She had absolutely no business interfering with the digital architecture of my real estate empire. Within 3 weeks, they had completely walled off the executive financial ledgers, Diane continued. They created a restricted digital environment that even I could not penetrate without Preston generating a daily authorization code. When I demanded answers, Preston handed me a massive severance package and threatened to drain my pension in endless litigation if I spoke to you. I closed my eyes tightly. I had allowed my own son to weaponize my company against my most loyal employees. But you did not just walk away, I said, meeting her sharp gaze. Diane permitted herself a grim smile and pulled an outdated, thick plastic laptop from her bag. No, I did not. I buried a ghost account deep inside the legacy code of the Human Resources portal. It is a digital backdoor that bypasses the central financial dashboard entirely. She connected a mobile hotspot and typed in complex code. The interface flashed green. The display was filled with endless columns of financial spreadsheets. Look right here. She pointed to a massive cluster of outgoing wire transfers. Millions of dollars are being falsely categorized as consulting fees and material acquisitions for projects that have been closed for months. I stared at the numbers: 700,000, 1.2 million, 3 million. It was a relentless waterfall of wealth pouring out of my empire. Can you trace the destination routing numbers? I asked. Diane shook her head in frustration. No. The digital trail hits a heavily encrypted firewall. We cannot prove fraud with just this raw data alone. But we do not need to trace it digitally. Monica is incredibly arrogant, Harrison, but she is also deeply paranoid. She does not trust digital encryption alone. When they forced me out, I accidentally intercepted an email from her private architect. She requested the immediate installation of a military-grade biometric floor safe, large enough to hold physical property deeds and financial ledgers. She wants the physical leverage in her own hands. My heart began to pound a furious rhythm. Where exactly did she install this biometric safe? Diane took a deep breath, delivering the devastating blow. She installed it in the primary master suite of the main estate. The blood completely drained from my face. 6 months ago, Preston had convinced me to let him and Monica move into the main house while their property was supposedly undergoing black mold remediation. I had generously moved myself into the guest wing. Now I realized it was a calculated lie designed to get Monica directly inside my home, to establish her base of operations. The evidence I needed to save my company and my freedom was locked inside a safe sitting in the middle of my own bedroom, while the 2 people trying to destroy me were currently sleeping in my bed. I left Diane at the dilapidated diner, promising to call the absolute second I had secured the physical documents. The drive back to the prestigious Cherry Creek neighborhood took exactly 40 agonizing minutes. It was 2 a.m, and a thick, heavy fog had rolled in, swallowing the streetlights and wrapping the sprawling millionaire estates in a blanket of gray mist. I parked my rented sedan 3 blocks away, carefully tucking it behind a dense row of tall hedges, and approached the heavy wrought iron gates of my own property. It was deeply unsettling to approach the majestic home I had meticulously built from the ground up, as if I were a common burglar. Preston had overhauled the perimeter security system 3 months ago, claiming the new motion sensors and advanced cameras would provide me with ultimate peace of mind. He was right, assuming I would never need to bypass it. But my son had drastically underestimated my meticulous nature. When the contractors installed the central control panel, I secretly requested the master analog override codes directly from the lead technician. Preston never knew those specific numerical sequences even existed. I approached the digital keypad hidden behind a stone pillar near the side gate. I punched in the sequence. The green indicator light flashed silently, and the heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a soft click. I stepped onto the manicured grounds of my estate. The towering silhouette of the mansion loomed ahead in the fog. Every single window was entirely dark. The house was completely silent. I moved cautiously across the damp grass, intentionally avoiding the gravel pathways to eliminate any crunching sounds, and made my way to the heavy French doors leading into the glass conservatory. I pulled a specialized electronic keycard from my wallet. This was my personal access card, coded to the absolute highest clearance level of the old security framework. I prayed Monica had not completely wiped my legacy credentials from the interior deadbolts. I slid the card into the slot. A tiny mechanical hum vibrated softly, and the brass handle turned easily in my hand. I stepped inside. The central air conditioning washed over me, carrying the familiar, comforting scent of polished mahogany and expensive leather. The house felt entirely foreign. The layout was exactly the same, but the internal energy had fundamentally shifted. I was a phantom trespassing in a life that had been stolen from me. I moved slowly through the grand foyer, allowing my eyes time to fully adjust to the deep shadows. I paused near the base of the sweeping double staircase. Above me, on the second floor, my son and his treacherous wife were sleeping comfortably in my own bed. I could almost hear their breathing drifting down through the cavernous space. The sheer audacity of their betrayal ignited a massive spark of fury in my chest. I desperately wanted to march up those stairs and demand answers, but unleashing my rage without undeniable evidence was exactly what they were counting on. I forced myself to focus entirely on the mission. I turned sharply and walked silently down the long, heavily carpeted hallway toward the west wing. This area used to be my private, secluded study. When Monica moved into the house, she immediately claimed the space, gutting my beautiful antique oak bookshelves and replacing them with sterile modern glass fixtures. It was now her absolute command center. The heavy door to her renovated home office was firmly closed. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening intently for any faint sign of movement. Absolute terrifying silence. I gently turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the pale light of the moon, filtering through the tall arched windows. The transformation of my beloved study was visually jarring. The dark, warm wood tones had been aggressively painted over in sterile shades of bright white and industrial gray. A sleek, massive glass desk sat perfectly in the center of the room, completely devoid of any paperwork. Monica was meticulously organized. She left absolutely nothing to chance in the open, but Diane had explicitly warned me about her deep paranoia. Monica desperately needed the psychological comfort of physical leverage. I closed the door softly behind me and stood perfectly still, letting my eyes sweep the painted walls. Diane had mentioned a massive art piece concealing the safe. My intense gaze landed securely on the far wall, where my prized collection of first-edition architectural texts used to sit. There was now a gigantic, chaotic abstract painting. It was a massive clash of black and dark red brushstrokes that looked entirely out of place against the sterile walls. It was the only item in the entire room that could possibly conceal a military-grade vault. I crossed the room quickly, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet, and stopped directly in front of the massive painting. It was incredibly heavy, framed in thick brushed steel. I carefully ran my index fingers along the bottom edge of the frame, searching desperately for a hidden latch. My fingertips brushed gently against a small recessed button hidden perfectly in the bottom right corner. I took a deep, shaky breath, physically steeling myself for what I was about to find, and firmly pressed the button. There was a sharp hydraulic hiss. The massive painting slid smoothly to the left on a cleverly concealed motorized track. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Embedded directly into the heavily reinforced drywall was a gleaming, state-of-the-art biometric safe. It was significantly larger than I had anticipated. The heavy steel door was finished in a dull matte black, featuring a complex digital keypad, an advanced retinal scanner, and a highly sensitive fingerprint reader. It looked like something pulled directly out of a high-security government facility. This was the beating heart of the beast. This vault held the detailed blueprint of my financial execution. The physical ledgers, the forged bankruptcy filings, the offshore shadow accounts. Everything Preston and Monica were actively using to dismantle my legacy was sitting right in front of me, locked securely behind 2 thick inches of solid titanium. I stared intensely at the blinking red light of the biometric scanner. Diane had told me about the safe, but neither of us had formulated a plan for bypassing a physical biometric lock. It specifically required Monica's exact biological data. I placed my hands flat against the cold metal door, a freezing wave of despair threatening to wash over me. Had I risked everything, broken into my own home, and sneaked past my betrayers, only to be stopped by a piece of reinforced steel? I closed my eyes tightly and forced my rising panic down. I had to think logically. I had to think exactly like the man who originally built this massive estate. When I constructed this mansion decades ago, I employed a highly specialized private security firm to install the internal network. I had explicitly demanded a universal analog override for every single electronic lock in the house, a deeply embedded, hardwired numerical sequence that entirely bypassed all biometric scans. It was an absolute fail-safe designed for catastrophic power failures or emergency medical situations. Monica had completely renovated the office and upgraded the software, but the physical safe was hardwired directly into the original structural grid of the house. If she used the estate's primary electrical conduit to power that vault, the legacy override code might still be active. I dropped to my knees, running my hands frantically along the baseboards beneath the safe until I found the small, flush-mounted maintenance panel. I popped the plastic cover off, revealing a tiny rudimentary numerical keypad that looked entirely out of place next to the advanced retinal scanner above it. I took a steadying breath. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip my own wrist to steady my index finger. I slowly punched in the 12-digit analog override code I had memorized 20 years ago. The small keypad beeped softly. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The silence in the room was completely suffocating. Then, a loud, heavy mechanical clank echoed from deep inside the titanium door. The blinking red light of the biometric scanner suddenly flashed a bright, vibrant green. The heavy steel door popped open a fraction of an inch, releasing a faint puff of compressed air. I grabbed the heavy handle and pulled the vault open. The interior of the safe was packed with meticulously organized manila folders, thick leather-bound ledgers, and several high-capacity encrypted hard drives. Monica had indeed kept a physical copy of absolutely everything. I reached in and pulled out the thickest ledger, flipping it open on the glass desk under the pale moonlight. The sheer scale of their betrayal was immediately, horrifyingly apparent. This was not a simple case of a greedy son skimming millions off the top of corporate accounts. The documents detailed a massive, highly sophisticated criminal conspiracy. I found the forged bankruptcy filings, complete with my flawlessly duplicated digital signature, ready to be submitted to a federal judge the exact moment my flight supposedly landed in Cambodia. I found the offshore shell companies Monica had established in the Cayman Islands, designed to catch the $40 million they were actively draining from my empire. But as I dug deeper into the physical files, I found something infinitely worse. I found heavily encrypted communication logs and secondary transfer receipts, proving that Preston and Monica were not just keeping the stolen money for themselves. They were systematically funneling massive portions of the $40 million into an illegal, high-stakes international gambling syndicate based in Macau. Preston had racked up tens of millions of dollars in catastrophic gambling debts. The violent cartel that ran the syndicate was aggressively demanding repayment, threatening his life. To save his own skin, my son had literally sold his father's entire corporate empire to an international crime syndicate. He was using the tech firm Monica, hired to launder the stolen corporate funds directly to the cartel, while perfectly framing me as the sole architect of the massive financial fraud. I stared at the documents, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. My son was not just a greedy coward. He was an active participant in international racketeering and terrorism financing. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I felt nothing but an absolute freezing void where my paternal love used to reside. I pulled my canvas duffel bag from my shoulder and began rapidly stuffing every single ledger, folder, and hard drive into the bag. I cleared the entire safe, leaving absolutely nothing behind except empty metal shelves. I pushed the heavy titanium door shut, ensuring the biometric lock re-engaged with a solid click, and slid the massive abstract painting back into its original position. I walked out of my own home like a ghost, disappearing back into the thick, freezing Colorado fog, with the definitive proof of their absolute destruction slung over my shoulder. I returned to Diane at the cheap motel. When I dumped the contents of the safe onto the squeaky mattress, her sharp eyes widened in sheer disbelief. For the next 3 weeks, the exact 3 weeks I was supposed to be completely off the grid, in the Cambodian jungle, Diane and I did not sleep. We worked out of that $40 a night motel room, fueled by cheap diner coffee and pure, unadulterated vengeance. Using the physical ledgers and the ghost accounts Diane had buried in the legacy code, we began a massive silent counter-offensive. We used my original, highly classified executive authorization codes, which Monica had failed to properly wipe from the analog servers, to completely reverse their financial maneuvers. We systematically intercepted the $40 million just before it cleared the final offshore gateways. We did not just pull the money back, we actively rerouted the massive corporate debt Preston had attempted to pin on me directly into the offshore shell accounts he and Monica had established under their own names. We legally transferred the catastrophic financial liability entirely onto their shoulders. Then, we compiled the forged bankruptcy filings, the communication logs with the Macau gambling syndicate, and the irrefutable proof of their massive corporate embezzlement. We bundled the entire devastating package into a secure, heavily encrypted digital dossier and forwarded it directly to the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically flagging it for the division that handles international terrorism financing and severe corporate racketeering. I spent the final days of my supposed vacation sitting in the dark motel room, watching the digital traps firmly snap shut, waiting patiently for the inevitable explosion. On the exact morning I was scheduled to land back in Denver, Preston was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany boardroom table at Caldwell Commercial Real Estate headquarters. Diane and I were parked 3 blocks away in a rented van, tapping directly into the corporate security cameras via her ghost access. Through the live video feed, I watched my son holding court. He was wearing an incredibly expensive suit, radiating absolute, unearned confidence. He was confidently informing the completely oblivious board of directors that the company was facing a sudden, tragic financial shortfall due to severe mismanagement by the former founder, and that emergency restructuring was absolutely necessary. He was executing the final phase of his massive lie, fully believing I was currently being detained by federal agents at the airport. He had absolutely no idea that the federal agents were not at the airport. They were currently riding the private executive elevators directly up to the boardroom. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently burst open. A dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers swarmed into the room with terrifying, military precision. The board members gasped in absolute shock, scrambling out of their expensive leather chairs. Preston froze, his confident smile instantly vanishing. He stood up slowly, raising his hands, his face draining of all color as the lead FBI agent marched directly toward him. The agent did not hesitate. He grabbed Preston by the lapels of his tailored suit, spun him around, and slammed him forcefully face first against the polished mahogany table. The sickening thud echoed clearly through the audio feed. "Preston Caldwell," the lead agent barked, his voice booming with uncompromising authority as he ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs tightly around my son's wrists. "You are under arrest for massive corporate fraud, international wire embezzlement, and actively financing an illegal racketeering syndicate. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." Preston began to thrash weakly against the table, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch of absolute terror. He screamed that it was a mistake, that he was the CEO, that his father was the one responsible for the missing funds. He begged his expensive corporate lawyers to intervene, but the legal counsel took one look at the federal warrant, explicitly detailing international terrorism financing, and immediately backed away, completely abandoning him. At the exact same moment, across town in the prestigious Cherry Creek neighborhood, a secondary tactical team was aggressively kicking down the front doors of my sprawling estate. The live feed from my home security cameras showed Monica being dragged out of the grand foyer in handcuffs, her expensive designer clothes disheveled, screaming hysterically, as the agents marched her out into the bright morning light. The live video feed of my son being aggressively pinned against the polished mahogany boardroom table played on the glowing screen of Diane's thick plastic laptop. The sheer terror radiating from Preston's pale face was deeply satisfying. We sat together in the rented van parked 3 blocks away, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouting echoing through the corporate headquarters. The massive empire I had built with my own 2 hands was actively being purged of the toxic parasites that had attempted to destroy it from the inside out. "It is time," I said quietly, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. I turned to Diane, offering her a genuine, grateful smile for the first time in 3 incredibly long weeks. "Thank you, Diane. You saved my company, and you saved my life. We saved it together." "Harrison," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. She reached over and squeezed my hand firmly. Now go in there and finish this. Reclaim your throne." I stepped out of the dark van and into the crisp, biting morning air of downtown Denver. I was not wearing the casual, comfortable vacation clothes my son expected me to be wearing in the Cambodian jungle. I was dressed in a classic, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, projecting the absolute, unwavering authority of the founder and legitimate owner of Caldwell Commercial Real Estate. I walked purposefully down the busy city block, my polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the concrete pavement. The massive glass and steel facade of the corporate headquarters loomed above me, a towering monument to my life's work. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and entered the expansive, bustling main lobby. The entire ground floor was in a state of absolute chaotic panic. Dozens of employees were clustered in small, nervous groups near the security turnstiles, whispering frantically about the massive FBI raid currently unfolding on the executive floors above. When they saw me walking toward the main elevators, a sudden, profound silence washed over the massive room. They stared at me in sheer disbelief. According to the corporate memos Preston had circulated, I was supposed to be completely off the grid on a tropical vacation, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic financial crisis currently destroying the firm. Yet here I was, looking entirely composed and completely in charge. The security guards stationed at the main desk immediately straightened their posture, recognizing the true authority in the building. They quickly swiped me through the secure turnstiles without a single word of hesitation. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The quiet hum of the machinery lifting me toward the boardroom felt incredibly grounding. For 3 agonizing weeks, I had lived like a fugitive in a cheap $40 a night motel, hiding from my own family, meticulously tearing apart their complex web of lies. Now, the absolute predator was finally stepping out of the shadows to reclaim his territory. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The executive floor was swarming with federal agents in dark windbreakers, systematically securing offices and seizing computer hard drives. I completely ignored the chaotic activity and marched directly toward the massive double-glass doors of the primary boardroom. 2 armed federal agents stood guard outside, but the lead investigator, the man Diane and I had directly communicated with using our encrypted ghost server, saw me approaching and immediately offered a respectful nod, stepping aside to allow me entry. I walked slowly into the boardroom. The scene was a spectacular display of absolute ruin. Preston was kneeling heavily on the plush carpet, his arms pulled tightly behind his back, his wrists secured in heavy steel handcuffs. His expensive Italian suit was wrinkled and disheveled from being slammed against the table. His perfectly styled hair was a messy, chaotic tangle. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer who had confidently lied to my face on the phone 3 weeks ago was completely gone, entirely replaced by a pathetic, weeping coward desperately begging the stoic federal agents for mercy. The remaining members of the board of directors were huddled in the far corner of the massive room, looking terrified and deeply confused. The moment my leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor just inside the doorway, Preston stopped crying. He slowly turned his head, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror. He stared at me as if I were a terrifying apparition rising straight from the grave. His mouth opened and closed silently, his mind violently struggling to process the impossible reality standing right in front of him. I was not stranded in a Cambodian jungle. I was not locked out of my accounts. I was standing in the center of my own boardroom, looking down at him with an expression of absolute, freezing contempt. "Dad," Preston choked out, his voice cracking into a high, weak, and pathetic whisper. "Dad, what are you doing here? You are supposed to be out of the country. They told me you were gone." I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from where he was kneeling on the floor. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely zero pity for the man I had raised. "You truly believed you had orchestrated the perfect corporate execution, didn't you, Preston?" I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and dangerously cold. "You thought you could simply put the clueless old man on an airplane, freeze his accounts, and steal $40 million right out from under his nose. You thought I was completely blind to your monumental arrogance." "No, Dad, please." Preston sobbed loudly, violently thrashing against the heavy handcuffs, his face slick with sweat and desperate tears. "You have to believe me, this is a massive misunderstanding. Monica forced me into this. She brought in the shadow tech firm. She is the one who wanted to steal the money. I was just trying to protect the company from her. She manipulated everything. You have to tell the federal agents to let me go. I am your son." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed sharply through the quiet boardroom. "Do you honestly expect me to believe you are an innocent victim, Preston? I know absolutely everything. I did not get on that airplane. I stood in the airport terminal and listened to you order the immediate bankruptcy of my entire legacy on your cheap burner phone. I broke into my own home in the dead of night. I bypassed the biometric safe Monica so carefully installed in my master bedroom. I read the physical ledgers. I saw the forged bankruptcy documents. I saw the encrypted communication logs with the violent Macau gambling syndicate. The sheer terror that washed over his pale face was the single most satisfying reward I had ever received. He realized in that exact moment that I had not just survived his trap, I had meticulously dismantled it from the inside out. "You did not just steal from me to fund your lavish lifestyle," I continued, leaning slightly closer to ensure he felt the absolute weight of his destruction. "You racked up tens of millions of dollars in catastrophic illegal gambling debts. You literally sold your father's entire corporate empire to an international crime syndicate to save your own miserable life. And you were completely willing to let me take the fall and rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my days." I was terrified. Preston screamed hysterically, tears streaming down his face. "They were going to kill me, Dad. The cartel threatened my life. I had no other choice. I had to get the money to pay them off. You have unlimited resources. You would have survived the bankruptcy. You always survive everything." "You had a choice," I stated firmly, my voice cutting through his pathetic excuses like a serrated knife. "You could have come to me like a man. You could have admitted your monumental failures. But instead, you chose treason. You chose to frame the father who gave you absolutely everything." Before Preston could formulate another desperate, pathetic lie, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open again. 2 federal agents marched into the room, aggressively dragging Monica between them. She was wearing a silk designer bathrobe, her hair a chaotic mess, her face completely drained of color. She had clearly been pulled directly from my sprawling estate in Cherry Creek. The heavy steel handcuffs binding her wrists looked completely jarring against her delicate, manicured hands. The moment Monica saw Preston kneeling on the floor, her manufactured facade of innocence completely shattered. She lunged toward him, her eyes burning with pure, toxic hatred, restrained only by the strong grip of the federal agents. "You stupid, pathetic degenerate!" Monica screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently through the boardroom. "You ruined absolutely everything. I set up the flawless digital ghost accounts. I built the perfect firewall. I secured the physical ledgers. The plan was absolutely perfect. We were supposed to walk away with $40 million, and you ruined it because you couldn't stop gambling." Preston completely snapped. He wrenched his head around and screamed back at his treacherous wife. "You told me the old man would never find out. You guaranteed the biometric safe was completely impenetrable. You dragged me into this massive cartel debt. You are the one who brought the shadow firm into the company." The federal agents quickly intervened, forcefully pulling the screaming, toxic couple apart. The sheer magnitude of their mutual betrayal was spectacularly pathetic to witness. They were desperately attempting to throw each other under the heavy wheels of federal justice to save their own miserable skins. There was absolutely no loyalty, no love, and no honor between them. They were simply two greedy parasites violently turning on each other in the cold, unforgiving light of the trap they had built for me. "Get them out of my building," I commanded the lead federal agent, completely turning my back on both of them. Preston began to sob uncontrollably as the agents roughly hauled him to his feet. "Dad, please, don't let them take me. I am your son. You cannot let them lock me away in a cage. Dad!" His desperate, hysterical screams slowly faded down the long executive hallway as the agents dragged him toward the secure elevators. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing the chaotic nightmare outside. I turned to the remaining, deeply terrified members of the board of directors. I adjusted my silk tie, walked directly to the absolute head of the massive mahogany table, and sat down heavily in my rightful chair. "Gentlemen," I said calmly, looking at each of them with an unwavering, commanding stare, "the toxic elements have been completely, permanently removed from this corporation. The financial ledgers are fully secure. The massive corporate debt my son attempted to illegally transfer has been fully reversed directly into his own offshore shell accounts. Caldwell Commercial Real Estate is entirely solvent. Now, if you will excuse me, I have an empire to run." 6 long months have passed since that incredibly satisfying morning in the corporate boardroom. The wheels of the federal justice system are notoriously slow, but when they finally turn, they grind with an absolute, crushing, and merciless certainty. The highly publicized trials were a spectacular media circus. The federal prosecutors did not even need to employ aggressive tactics. Presented with the undeniable physical ledgers I had pulled from the biometric safe, the forged bankruptcy filings, and the deep digital footprint Diane had secured, the defense completely collapsed. Preston and Monica violently turned on each other in open court, wildly trading vicious accusations in a desperate bid for a lighter sentence. The presiding federal judge showed absolutely zero mercy. Monica was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary for international money laundering and corporate espionage. Preston received a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 12 years in a maximum security facility for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and actively financing a known international terrorist syndicate. The massive $40 million they had attempted to steal was fully recovered and safely returned to my private trusts. The heavy corporate debt they tried to dump on my shoulders was legally pinned entirely on them, completely bankrupting them before they even stepped foot inside a prison cell. Today, I found myself walking slowly through the sterile, heavily fortified security corridors of a massive federal penitentiary located in the freezing, remote mountains of Colorado. I was not there to offer forgiveness. I was not there to seek closure. I was there because I needed to look my son in the eyes one final time and ensure he fully comprehended the absolute, inescapable finality of his profound failure. The heavy steel gates buzzed loudly and slid open. I stepped into the bleak, incredibly depressing visitor center. The room smelled of harsh industrial bleach and profound human despair. I sat down on a hard plastic chair in front of a thick pane of scratched, bulletproof glass. I waited patiently in the uncomfortable silence. 5 minutes later, a heavy metal door on the opposite side of the glass opened. A heavily armed guard escorted my son into the small booth. The sight of my former son was genuinely, profoundly shocking. The arrogant, impeccably groomed chief executive officer who had so confidently tried to destroy my life was completely gone. He was wearing a shapeless, heavily faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. His skin was incredibly pale, stretched tightly across his cheekbones. His hair was messy and unkempt. The dark, heavy bags beneath his eyes spoke of endless, terrifying nights spent in absolute fear. He sat down heavily on the metal stool across from me, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the scratched metal counter between us. He slowly picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. I mirrored his action, pressing the plastic firmly against my ear. "Thank you for coming," Preston mumbled into the phone. His voice was incredibly raspy and remarkably weak. He sounded like a completely shattered, entirely empty shell of a human being. I was beginning to think you would never speak to me again. I am not here to offer you absolution, Preston, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. I came here today to close this chapter permanently. I came to look you in the eyes and ensure you fully comprehend the absolute finality of your situation. Preston finally looked up. His eyes were brimming with desperate, terrified tears. "Dad, please," he begged, leaning forward against the thick glass, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "I am begging you for help. This place is an absolute, living nightmare. The people in here are violent monsters. I cannot survive 12 long years in this cage. I need you to hire a better legal team. I need you to fund a massive appellate campaign. We can argue that I was under extreme duress from the cartel. We can say they forced me to sign those forged documents. You have unlimited resources. You can easily afford the best defense attorneys in the country. You can get me out of here, please, Dad. I am your family." I stared at him through the thick, smudged glass. I felt absolutely zero empathy for the weeping, pathetic man sitting across from me. He was still actively trying to manipulate the situation. He was still entirely refusing to accept personal responsibility for his treacherous, unforgivable actions. "You are exactly where you belong," I stated coldly, refusing to break intense eye contact. "You made a conscious, deliberate choice to borrow tens of millions of dollars from a highly violent criminal syndicate. You chose to secretly gamble away an absolute fortune in underground casinos. You chose to forge my signature and actively attempt to frame me for your catastrophic failures. You put a definitive price tag on my freedom and my life to save your own skin. I did it because I was terrified." Preston sobbed loudly into the receiver, wiping his wet face with his shaking hands. "I made a terrible mistake. I know I did. But you are my father. You are supposed to protect me. You are supposed to help me when I fall." I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between us, until my face was merely inches from the glass. True accountability means facing the devastating consequences of your actions entirely alone, I told him, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper that sliced through his hysterical weeping. "I gave you every conceivable advantage in this world. I gave you an elite education, a massive, heavily funded trust fund, and a prominent seat at the head of a billion-dollar empire. You squandered every single gift because you possessed absolutely zero character. You are not a victim, Preston. You are the sole architect of your own destruction. I will not spend a single cent of my hard-earned money trying to save you from the prison sentence you entirely deserve." Preston stared at me in absolute, horrifying shock. His desperate tears stopped flowing, completely replaced by a look of profound, crushing realization. He finally understood the absolute truth. The massive safety net he had aggressively exploited his entire life was permanently gone. The unlimited bank accounts were securely closed. The blindly protective, forgiving father he had known was completely dead. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I stood up slowly from the cold plastic chair. I adjusted the lapels of my heavy winter coat and looked down at him one last time. "Goodbye, Preston," I said firmly, hanging the heavy black receiver back onto the metal hook with a definitive click. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the heavy exit door. I did not look back when he suddenly began to sob loudly behind the glass. I did not hesitate when the armed guards ordered him to stand up and return to his miserable, concrete cell. I walked straight through the sterile security corridors, my footsteps echoing with absolute, unwavering certainty. The heavy steel gates buzzed loudly and slid open, allowing me to step outside into the crisp, freezing Colorado air. The bright morning sun hit my face, warming my skin against the biting winter wind. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with pure, unburdened freedom. The toxic leeches were finally gone. My empire was entirely secure. I walked toward my waiting car, fully ready to embrace a new, powerful chapter of my life. For decades, I truly believed that giving my son absolutely everything was the ultimate expression of a father's deep love. I was completely wrong. True love isn't about blindly writing blank checks or softly cushioning every single fall. It is about instilling deep character, unwavering integrity, and absolute accountability. When you blindly hand over immense power without demanding respect, you don't build a strong heir. You create a ruthless, entitled monster. Blood might technically make you family, but unwavering loyalty and honesty are what actually keep you there. I had to completely lose the comforting illusion of the son I wanted to finally see the treacherous man he actively chose to be. Sometimes the hardest boundary you ever set is the exact one that ultimately saves your life.